Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining another PKI Solutions webinar. This one is going to be overcoming HSM challenges with enhanced visibility. And today we're joined by the man himself, Mark Cooper. He's going to be actually going through a lot of this presentation. But those of you that know me, Brad Butlick, I'm the Director of Sales here at PKI Solutions. I spent 15 years in the HSM space. So I have a lot of experience in that space. So Mark and I are going to go through this presentation. He's going to throw some questions to me. I'm going to throw some questions to him and really talk about the importance of having a visibility into your HSMs. I can know before I hand this over to Mark, one of the things I can say about HSMs is a lot of people implement the HSM into their environment because it's the right thing to do, or they're being forced to do it for some audit reason. And it's one of these devices that's put in, and once it's put in, it's never touched again, and they hope it continues to be working. And a lot of times it's not. So that's one thing that Mark is going to kind of talk about, why it's important to make sure that that ridiculously high investment, sorry, Thales and Entrust, if you're on this call, you really, really need to know that it is operating properly, securely, and it's doing the job it's supposed to do. So that is an introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Mark and take it away, Mark.
Yeah. Well, Brad, thanks for the great introduction. I feel like this should probably be a webinar that you're leading, but it's great to be able to kind of go through this with you.
I can talk about why one would use an HSM, and even though I'm no longer associated with any of the manufacturers, I still am a very big fan of the purpose of an HSM within organizations. And I've often said that the HSM does two things, and it does it really well. It generates secure keys and stores secure keys. Yeah. That's really kind of the main focus of it. But we're talking about the visibility into those HSMs, which is what we at PKI Solutions do. So
yeah, in some ways, this is a little bit of the case of a necessary evil. There are certain risk issues that can only be mitigated through a hardware security module. But when used incorrectly, or when this kind of deployed and forgotten about, is just a waiting disaster, which is never a great thing in the cybersecurity space. So we're going to talk a little bit about what HSMs are and why they're even here. We'll talk about some of the challenges, and then frankly the visibility, and why we're honing in on this visibility challenge is frankly most organizations that we interact with from a hardware perspective are using PKIs, and what we're essentially dealing with is PKI is a black box for a lot of organizations. It's a technology they've deployed and they don't really have a sense moment to moment what's going on, and then behind it is another foundational thing of a hardware security module. So we've got a black box behind a black box that is the underpinnings of the entire identity system. I thought a great way to kind of get started as we go in is I'm going to open up one of our first polls here. For those of you that are joining us, I'd love to find out how many of you have already had some type of an HSM related issue. And we're kind of calling it because of limited visibility, meaning was it a failure of an HSM and you just didn't know what was going on? Have you had out-of-date firmware issues, connectivity issues, network hiccups, just something relating to challenges with a hardware security module? So while that poll is open, let's talk a little bit about what an HSM is. And Brad, when you spent your many decades in this space, did you ever have someone come to you and say, what the heck is an HSM? And if so, like what would you tell them a hardware security module is all about?
Yeah, I got that question a lot. And I think one of the challenges is that they are very expensive, and people, it's like, why do I need to spend this much money for something that I can do in software? Yeah. And that's where I had to, explain to them that within software, there's really, you really cannot create a truly strong key, because one of the things that's required to create a really strong key is a hardware-based certified random number generator. Yeah. And what the hell is a random number generator? It is literally a device that sits there and creates what they call a random number that has a certain amount of what they call entropy. So it has to be truly random. And it's one of those concepts that's really kind of hard for people to understand. It's like, are all random numbers random? And the best way I was ever described that was if you had the old iPod shuffle or the old iPod that would shuffle through the library of songs that you had in your iPod. And even if you had 1,000 songs in your iPod, there was a chance that the same song would be played twice because there wasn't anything checking for entropy. Random number generators create these random numbers and test for entropy, and you can go into even much more in-depth calculations to calculate something that's that random, and that's important. When you're talking about a cryptographic element, a randomness is the actual foundation for a lot of cryptography. So if you don't have that, you run the risk that what you're creating from a key or certificate perspective isn't truly secure. And that's where, as we're moving into the quantum space, that's going to be the place where most quantum computers are going to dive in, is the randomness of the key that's being created. The other thing I would say is, if you're storing a key in software, where are you storing it? And due to the randomness of a key, one of the things that you can test for is the randomness of a file. So all files have a certain amount of patterns to them, but key files don't. They're incredibly random. So if you are a hacker, you've gone through the firewall, you're into the system, you're trying to find that cryptographic key, all you have to do is start searching for things that are heavily random. And that's going to, the chances are that something that's heavily random is going to be some type of cryptographic material or some type of key. Yeah. So by using a hardware security module that is tested by a NIST, the U.S. standard for security testing, when it's tested by NIST, you can be somewhat secure in the knowledge that the key is going to be stored properly, and the bad guys aren't going to be able to access the key. Because if they access the key, all the work that you put into, let's say, encrypting a database or creating a certificate is going to be lost. So that's where I've tried to convince companies that putting it in software is not good enough. If you're really paranoid and if you really want security, you have to put your cryptographic material into a hardware security module.
Yeah, and when it comes to PKI, the conversation that we typically have with customers of the why isn't HSM involved in a PKI is when we think about all of the certificates, all of the identities that we're creating are signed by a certificate authority. That certificate authority has an identity key. When that key exists in software, any copy of that key can be used to create more identities for other users or computers. So we think about non-human identities, we think about administrative accounts. If I can copy a CA's key, I can go into a basement anywhere in the world and start minting certificates that are trusted in an organization. So we look at hardware security modules as a risk mitigation. I can look at a hardware security module in a data center and say the identity for my certificate authority, my PKI, is in that box, and I can physically see it, and I know that there's one copy of that key in the universe right there where I can physically prove it. When it is a key for my CA that exists in software, every backup I make, every backup I don't even know was made, any adversary that accessed that key and extracted it could be creating identities. It's this false sense of security to say, yep, I have a PKI, it must be secure. Hardware security modules are kind of a necessary evil. That being said, there are some scenarios where they're not appropriate. Organizations that don't have the necessary maturity to be able to rack and stack and manage another appliance, where there's a desire to have no data center. Now we have things like HSM as a service. There are some modifications there. But when we look at a risk profile, some organizations, frankly, are doing PKI and doing certificates at a maturity level that they're not necessarily worried about direct adversarial attacks, meaning someone coming into their environment and stealing cryptographic keys. They've accepted that risk. But the conversation that we have is, you should at least make this decision. Do you want to mitigate the risk of software-based keys? And if so, you need to implement a hardware security module. There's many different ones out there. Or have you at least made an informed decision to say, this risk will exist in our organization and we're okay. Now, an interesting thing, Brad, I don't know if you looked at the results of the poll, but across this, less than half of the people have said, yes, we've had issues, but we resolved it quickly. Now, I will always say quickly is a very subjective term. I've heard customers say, well, once we knew what the problem was, we were able to quickly fix it. That was after 8 hours of the problem. But more than half of people have either said it's caused downtimes, no, but they have had worry about it or have had challenges. And only 2%, 8% of people have actually said, no, we haven't had any issues. We have full visibility. Congratulations. It's not surprising to see that the vast majority have had some type of an issue. It is a living, breathing device in a cryptographic sense, and it needs care and feeding. Now, that kind of leads into the why. Why are there challenges there? Brad, as you've kind of worked with these hardware security modules over time, I can imagine you've seen some crazy issues of challenges of managing these, not just deciding to buy one, but what are some of the issues that you've seen or that you've had to talk to customers around managing and the complexity and implementations and life cycles? Like, what is that like for a typical organization?
Well, I think one of the issues they have is that most of the HSMs, the HSM manufacturers, they take the security aspect of logging into the HSM to extract data from it very seriously. It's actually been harder than I think most people think to create a remote access management tool for an HSM. And the current manufacturers have gone through a number of different iterations to come up with the configurations that they presently use. There's still the security of that remote reach into the HSM to extract the information is very onerous. And because of that, I think a lot of people are reluctant to actually log into these devices to extract that information. And as such, that it is the black box device that not a lot of people want to touch. Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I walked into data centers where the HSMs that I'd sold were installed, and there was like little yellow or little pink sticky notes on the HSM.
The infamous yellow sticky note. Don't turn off. This is needed.
Do not touch.
Don't touch.
And that seems to be the way a lot of companies look at their HSMs. It's once it's up and operational, take your hands off of it, don't touch it again, and don't even breathe on it. And that's where, and I think one of the things that we're doing is providing the access, the monitoring access to the HSM without having to go through the complexity or the security risk of remote access. I did work with a customer for a number of years where the CIO of the company said, "Thou shalt never have remote access to an HSM, never." Yeah. And he wouldn't even talk about it. It's like if they needed to have anything done with the HSM, they had to get permission to go into the data center and then permission to open up the rack and then permission to actually work on the device in front of it. They would never remotely access it. And that was because, the concept is if you can remote access an HSM, there's still an option for some bad guy to do some nefarious act from another part of the world doing the same thing. So that's where, but the like what we're doing, and I hope you explain it, the monitoring that we can have on an HSM does not open up another threat vector.
Yeah. The issue that we typically run into is the organizations that have decided to use a hardware security module. And we don't have enough time to really go into the intricacies of who should and shouldn't. At the end of the day, there's quite a bit of a strategic decision to use a hardware security module. And by the way, I saw the comment. I'm just going to go officially on the record and say UBHSM is not an HSM. I know they're out there. I respect those organizations that want to go that direction. But once you start looking at how do I really move my key from one device to another, or the fact that I have something now so small that I'm no longer physically locking that into a data center, it's an interesting alternative. It works great in a lab environment. But the challenges that organizations have, they're afraid of touching the box. Once it gets set up, sometimes by the vendor, they'll come in and do a rapid deploy. and then the PKI gets connected, and nobody wants to touch that box again. And because there's no visibility, it is essentially a little bit of an LCD screen. I think the Incypher stuff still has kind of an iPod joggle style display that nobody really goes in. So now you've got this higher level identity systems, your PAM systems, your ITDRs, your firewalls, your TLS inspection, depending on certificates, which is dependent on your PKI, which is dependent on an HSM buried somewhere in your data center, that without the visibility, we have challenges. So here's a great example of issues that we've had. A lot of times we'll deploy HSMs in a high availability configuration because it is a critical component to run my cryptographic key for my CA. If my hardware security module fails, my CA fails, which means I can't create revocation lists, which means all of my certificates are going to be affected. Like this is a significant thing. So we'll deploy two of them, for example. If you don't have visibility of what's going on with those two HSMs, we've had many customers that have had a failed HSM. They're now running on one. What's worse than only having one HSM? It's when you assume that you're in a high availability state and you're not as nervous about it, because when you're the organization that only bought one of these, you're a little more concerned of what happens when that one fails. You find out much quicker because everything breaks. The organizations that are deploying high availability, we have some of them that have gone weeks and weeks, sometimes months, not knowing that an HSM failed because the CA just kept using the other module. That's great from an operational perspective, but if they don't know that there's a failed HSM, they don't know they need to get it replaced. They don't know that they're already in that disaster state. So that lack of visibility is a problem. And because there's not great expertise, no one is going into the data centers, no one's using the available tools, it becomes one more black box in the PKI environment. That, along with, frankly, I'm just going to say, esoterical skills of setting up an HSM. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people here have a PKI that use an HSM and they didn't set it up. It's just been there. And maybe they've done OS upgrades, they continue to manage the PKI. And when there's an issue, they call the vendor, they look in the documentation. And it doesn't help that, Incypher versus Luna versus Utamako versus FutureX, they all do things different. They're all hardware security modules. They're all protecting cryptographic keys, but every single one of them has different command sets, different security methods, different concepts of keys in the box, keys in the security world. There are a million different ways of doing this. Are there particular examples that you can think of where these HSM challenges have bitten customers? Like what's the impact that you've seen in some places?
I've seen where I think one of the biggest problems is, the hands off. They kind of, they put it and forget it. And they get this false sense of security that their systems are.
I have an HSM, I'm done, right?
I have an HSM, I'm done. Or it's, even further, it's like, I've got a PKI with an HSM, I'm done.
Yeah.
And, it's the lack of real understanding within corporate America for cryptography in general is appalling. I mean, most organizations, and I've said this before, I've said it publicly, have, they spend much more time, concerned with their firewalls than they do with cryptography. And, cryptography is not easy, but there's got to be somebody or some group of people within your organization that understand it well and do not look at it in fear. And that's the biggest issue I've always run into, is people are afraid of these things. And I think just the simple fear of them, they're incredibly valuable tools. Don't get me wrong. I think the one person was saying, it sounds too complicated, take care, I'm out of here. It's not. It's something that, especially as we're getting into the post-quantum stage, HSMs, I think, are going to become even more important. And this whole cryptography is going to become more important. And organizations need to really assign a couple of people within their organization that are really, truly experts in crypto, and they understand things like PKI and certificates and HSMs. I mean, you think about the IoT devices. The most incredible IoT device that's on the market right now is probably these new self-driving cars. Mm-hmm. Well, they're all certificate based as it pertains to the download of software. So you don't want to have some bad actor downloading bad software to one of these self-driving cars in order to take control of the car and then, drive it off a bridge or something like that. So that's where, absolutely positively, if you're not using an HSM, you're stupid. I'm sorry. That's just the fact of the matter.
There's places where there's no question of it, right? But a lot of our enterprises are, some have a different risk profile. Some of them are a different maturity space. It's ultimately at the end of the day when they decide to do it. Now, an interesting thing that the poll that we just ran on, what are some of the HSM management challenges that they have? A good third of people said just managing and training of skilled administrators on the HSMs. The other third said access to insights on the configuration availability. So that's just visibility, subject matter expertise. 16% said detecting and responding to outages. And then the other quarter said navigating vendor-specific tools. So there's a lot of aspects of these hardware security modules that can cause problems. And why it really matters is that lack of visibility means you're not going to be able to detect early challenges, early issues with hardware security modules that will result in issues. So, one of the things that we've started doing is if we can detect that a CA can't talk to a hardware security module, and we can do that before the CA needs to do something, you're detecting failures before there's an outage. And this is a great story I like to share with one of our customers where a group had pushed out a network patch to a number of servers that included their CAs, and just so happened to include an update to some network drivers. That update caused the connection between the CA and their hardware security module to go into an errored state. But the CA didn't need to do anything for a couple more days, but the OS just kept running. The CA service kept running because it didn't need to actually interact with its cryptographic keys. When it went to go sign that CRL, it needed to talk to the HSM. Couldn't reach it because the network patch had caused a problem. The CA fell over, the CRL couldn't get signed, and there was a massive outage. That was a visibility issue. It wasn't necessarily even just an HSM problem. It was, I can't get access to my HSM, which is a big issue. My network dependency is a big thing. And there was just a question that came in of, what about cloud HSMs? It's one thing to say, hey, I no longer have to worry about the firmware of this device because I'm buying the HSM as a service from my cloud provider. But if my CA can't talk to that thing, is just as good as a complete failure of that HSM. So if I got firewall issue, I've got network issue, I've got availability issue, not having the visibility to figure out my CA is actually at any moment capable of talking to that cloud HSM, there's an issue. And that's why we use tools like Spotlight, where we can actually exercise the CA, OCSP, all of these other roles to say, hey, is everything going on properly to my hardware security module?
And the most important part of that, Mark, sorry to interrupt you, is that we can do that without logging into the PKI or the HSM. And you can do this and push any button you want on the screen without any fear that it's going to do something to your PKI or your HSM.
Yes.
That's huge.
Yeah, and we've kind of taken on the harder part of that of bringing visibility into it without using credentials. This has been a hard thing, but being in the PKI space for a long time, I told the team, hey, we need to solve the visibility challenge, but we're not going to introduce new security risks. We're not going to say, hey, let's start storing credentials and API keys and those things. Let's solve the visibility issue. So for our customers that are using cloud HSMs, in fact, we just met with a large prospective customer that said, oh, we're actually using a managed PKI and it has a cloud HSM. Well, guess what? The cloud HSM service had a problem. And that managed PKI provider didn't see it as their responsibility to even notify the customer that there's an issue. With the visibility challenges that we solved, we could have actually said, hey, there's an issue going on with the the cloud HSM and given somebody an indication ahead of time that there was problems. So solving these vendor challenges, whether it's Incipher and Luna, that's where we've started today. Doing that with no credentials hasn't been easy. I'll just go on the record and say that the people at Thales did not make it easy for us to figure out all of the stuff on the Luna to be able to show without credentials. And in fact, the team dug up so much stuff on the partition configurations that it wasn't even the documentation from the Luna perspective. So we had to do a lot of hard work. So to expect administrators that are just trying to run their PKI to know all the nuances of the HSM is a hard thing. When you start looking at all the stuff that customers don't do, I'm going to guess you could answer this question the same way I would do. Do you know of any customer that's ever proactively reached out to you and said, I think it's time for me to update the firmware on my HSM?
No, ever.
No.
Yeah.
No, right?
We had to force companies to upgrade the firmware on their HSM because they were so far back from current, and it was just an absolute fear that something would happen, something would break if they upgrade. It's the if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality of in the IT world.
They don't update firmware. They don't update the client software. Again, it's a black box behind a black box behind a PKI that people are just barely keeping up and running. So having visibility of what firmware is on what boxes, where we see trying to change this a little bit is, okay, great. What if we take all of those really hard to digest emails from the vendors of, hey, if you're on this platform and you've got this firmware, here's the FIPS version of the firmware, here's the non-FIPS version of the firmware, and here's the end of life. Digesting all of that and just including it in the visibility so we can say, hey, this thing's got a new firmware version. My laptop does that. Like my laptop at least comes up and says, there's a new version of the firmware. Do you want to update? The HSM just doesn't do that kind of stuff. So visibility across the spectrum, and
not being afraid of them.
Yeah, and not being afraid of it. And for us today, I know we just put out a release that we are now doing this for Luna and Incipher in a single product. Like this is the first time that there's been visibility of multiple HSMs from different manufacturers in one place. Now that doesn't typically come up in a PKI environment. Most organizations running a PKI will have one or the other. But some of our customers have a large number of HSMs doing other stuff in their environment. And today it's Luna and Incipher. We will be solving the same problems for Utamako, FutureX, Crypto4a. There's a whole host of them, and it works with the cloud HSM. So bringing visibility in. So at the end of the day, let's leave our attendees with some good things. So one is if you are treating your HSMs as black boxes, you didn't deploy it, you didn't set it up, you don't know what they are, you haven't looked at it for a while, it hasn't bitten you, at least go figure out where the heck they are. Like just go see if there's an orange light on there. We just had it in our own lab where I just happened to walk in and sure enough, one of our HSMs had failed. Luckily, our software had caught it. I actually did a blog about this. But at least start figuring out what you have and start bringing visibility. What can you do? What does the manufacturer provide you? And then, obviously we have options that we can bring you as well. The other thing is start thinking about these things as something that need lifecycle maintenance, firmware updates, client software, regular checks on the HSMs. Just because it's a black box with a tiny little, iPod style shuffle wheel on it, maybe at least make sure that your CA components, your OCSP can actually talk to the HSM. I've seen scenarios where customers have bought HSMs and the CA wasn't even configured to use it. And they said, yes, we have HSMs. They forgot to connect it. The other one is the CA will absolutely be up and running even if it can't talk to an HSM. You should make sure that it's actually valid. And I will tell you, the vendor software sucks. They'll all tell you it's operational. They'll tell you it's okay. It's not until you actually exhaustively interact with them that you'll figure this out. So don't let this escape your visibility. Start some regular care and feeding of your hardware security modules, because they're the one thing that's most removed that's going to bite you. You are building a foundation technology that everything else is built on. The neglect of your hardware security modules, neglect of your PKI is going to affect everything else. And then lastly, there is training documentation out there. I know it's hard to consume, but there are training courses. All the manufacturers have it. You can go get certified on the hardware security modules. Just don't neglect them. Spend the time. You cannot afford these to be so critical in your infrastructure that you have no visibility and you have nothing that you're doing about this. So there's some best practices that you can take away from this today. I implore you at least figure out if there's already any lights on there, what firmware things are going on, what your plan is to make sure that these things are working. Because the good news is, if you've got the visibility, you can prevent outages proactively. Because when your hardware security module fails, you may have anywhere from no time to multiple days to prevent an outage. And the only way that you're going to figure that out is if you're getting real-time information. Brad, anything else that you would add that you would implore our attendees to start doing today in regards to HSMs?
Yeah, figure out how to not be afraid of them as much as you are,
Yeah.
and to just treat them as another device that's in your network, and to really start getting more control, not next to it, to monitor its aspects much more clearly, and do not be lulled into the false sense of security that you have an HSM in place. I'm secure. So
maybe take those Post-it notes and draw a little smiley face on there, so you're not so afraid of it, and it becomes something that you're comfortable with.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think we had another great webinar. Brad, I think you've got something to share.
Yes, we have another webinar coming up next week or next month. It's like how to secure your identity and encryption system. We're going to be talking about that next month. So please tune in next month for another great webinar. And we will see you then. And in the meantime, have a wonderful day and the rest of this month and going into the beginning of next month.
Yeah, the start of spring in the Northern Hemisphere and the start of fall in the Southern. So looking forward to it. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.